Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Christopher Fletcher. I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library in Chicago. And I am thrilled to welcome you all to today's installment of Race in Dialogue, a conversation series from our center that features discussions between scholars of pre-modern critical race studies and or critical indigenous studies. Our session today will be one of our first our next sort of latest installment in this series that we're very, very excited about. We are honored to have two brilliant scholars of early modern literature and theater with us today, Miles Greer and Wilneed Lindor. We are looking forward to hearing them discuss a bit about their own experience with research and teaching in this very important field. And they will also speak about the future of PCRS at this very challenging moment here in the United States. In just a few seconds, we will be putting their websites into the chat now, and we will also provide info about their publications in the chat during the conversation so that we can keep all the time for this wonderful conversation. Before they begin with that, though, we would like to take some time to read the Newberry's land acknowledgement. So, as part of our commitment to addressing the ongoing legacies of dispossession and settler colonialism, as well as our relationships with the city, the land, and the environment, the Newberry Library has crafted this acknowledgement in partnership with the Chicago American Indian Center. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations, the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, and the Miamia, Wea, Takiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose lands we are situated. And since this is a virtual event, you all, our panelists and audience members, are joining us from many different places. So wherever you currently are, we encourage you to learn about how you may be of service to the people on whose lands you are situated and seek to understand your place within the history that has brought you to reside there. So with that, we'll turn it over now to Miles and Wilneed. Thank you both so much for being here. Just so everybody knows how this is going to go, we'll start taking questions from the audience around 30 to 40 minutes into the conversation. However, at any time, you should feel free to put your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and then we will get to those once we reach the discussion portion. But for now, that's quite enough for me. And I'm happy to now turn it over to Miles and Wilneed. Thank you both so much for being here.
Well, hello, we'll need.
Hi.
How are you?
Good, good, good. In the thick of, exam week and all the things, but overall good. How are you doing?
I'm okay. The cold snap has me shook, but there are worse things.
Right, right, yeah.
Well, I almost made myself a cup of tea because, this kind of conversation is something that we've had intermittently ever since I was your professor when you were an undergraduate. But I thought that despite the fact that we know each other so well, it might be good for us to introduce ourselves to the audience before we have some tea together. Could you talk a little bit about how you became interested in early modern and where you're situated now?
Okay, great, great. So first off, I just want to take the time real quickly just to thank Leah Markey, Dylan Bingham, Christopher Fletcher, and the Newberry Center for Renaissance Studies for organizing this wonderful opportunity for Miles and I to sit down, have some tea, right, and talk together. So thank you so much for organizing this time. So, just a little bit about me, and then also my interest in the early modern period. So again, my name is Wilneed Lindor. I'm an assistant professor at the State University of New York at Cortland, and my research and teaching focuses on pre-modern critical race studies, early modern poetry and drama, metaphysical poetry, and then also some gender studies as well. And my current research is interested in thinking about the relationship between ventriloquism, rhetoric, and processes of racial formation in the 16th and 17th century. And so now, segueing into sort of how I became interested in the early modern period, it all begins in at Queens College. Prior to your class, I took a British Lit survey course, and at the time it was actually by a graduate student, but it was brilliant. I'll talk more about that a bit later on. But it was the first time that I was sort of exposed to the sort of survey course style. In relation to British literature. And so um, during that period, we studied Milton's Areopagitica, and I was really moved by Milton's passionate argument concerning like the defense against pre-publication censorship. And particularly as he was thinking about sort of that licensing order of like 1643. And what really moved me about Milton's argument was this idea of like, okay, yes, though literary texts are inanimate objects, but they do still carry like the lifeblood or the vitality of the writers, you know. And I was just like, hmm. Milton was able to express something that at the time I always felt as a reader, but didn't really know how to fully express. And so it was the first time where I sensed a feeling of kinship to the early modern period through Milton's work. And then not long after that, I had your class. And it was quite interesting to me to think about the ways that you placed early modern history alongside with in conversation with American literature and history. And that was also the first time that I saw the bridging of the two. And I think at the time too, we were talking about this. Queens College was like sort of transforming. We were like the pilot class, so to speak, of like this new transformation of sort of how they're kind of thinking about the curricular changes they were doing at the time. And so your class was like that. We were a part of that first iteration of that. I'm curious to know if it's still a thing, but so yeah. And then in terms of, should we talk about PCRS too, or should we just wait for?
Well, I mean, I guess yes, because what's interesting to me, because part of this is news to me. I didn't know about the Milton experience.
Mm,
That's, as you said, before we met. But that's a great segue to PCRS because these first experiences don't have anything to do with the study of race in the period, right? Because we were reading Henry V, and um, it's not obviously a race play. I mean, Umberine Databoy is doing some work on it now, so um, the Islamophobia in it is about to be further exposed. Uh, but yeah, how did you get from Milton and Harry to PCRS?
yeah. Um, so PCRS, my interest in PCRS began in graduate school. So I happened to sort of return back to Othello, sort of rereading Othello again. Up until that point, I had the experience of reading Othello prior to undergrad. So it was years later, I end up rereading Othello. And at the time, I was also reading Fanon, I was reading Patrick Chamoiseau. I was thinking about, I was really interested in the Negritude movement and the Créolité movement. And so as I was reading these other, writers, I then was also sort of struck by the things I just didn't see before in Othello. And particularly, I was really fascinated by Othello's sort of final speech, self-deprecating speech, where he's just saying, speak of me as I am, you know. And I was just like, why is he telling Ludovico to do, like, why this insistence, And also, it seemed kind of, honestly, frankly, random that Shakespeare would create a Moorish character that would demand agency over the narrative that is about to be publicized in these like letters, um, and sort of wanting to have agency over discussing what parts of the events that have transpired up until that point in the play, what should be omitted, what should be sort of added. And so I was just like, what is going on? And so it surprised me. And so I was like, okay, I'm sure there are folks that have written about this or about even just race in the early modern in general. And so I eventually just started searching and like looking up different scholarship. And then I stumbled upon Kim Hall's Things of Darkness. And Things of Darkness literally catapulted me into the world of PCRS that I had not known about prior to.
And what a catapult that was. Well, I will speak a little bit about my story, um, which I want to first quickly set in the 90s. The I graduated undergrad in 2000. So my first experience, it's sort of strange that I work on the early modern because my high school experience with Shakespeare was bewildering and disappointing. I didn't understand a word of it and I didn't like it. Um, and then in college, I took a required course that's no longer required in most places called practical criticism, which is where you use new critical methods, formal analysis, rhythm, rhyme, all the things related to just form. Um, and that's where I learned to read poetry. And then suddenly, we actually had a Shakespeare requirement then. It was the only single author course that you had to take. And I'd put it off because of my negative high school experience. And I'd sort of become an 18th century aficionado in the meantime, and an early 19th century American aficionado as well. Um, and so when I finally took Shakespeare in the last semester of my senior year, because I'd put it off that long, um, there was a kind of undercurrent in the scholarship that you couldn't talk about race, which was, of course, central to the 19th century American work I'd been doing and the 18th century British work I'd been doing. Uh, and I thought, well, the things I'm reading in Shakespeare seem to be precursors to what I'm seeing in 18th century British literature and seem to still be echoing in the 19th century American literature I'm reading. Why this prohibition? Um, and then I too found Kim Hall's Things of Darkness, and that's the portal for so many of us. Not that it was the first work on race in the field, but it was a watershed in its own way. And so, you know, that's how it started. And what I wound up producing in my book Ink Face was actually something that brought all of that together. It's an Othello-focused book, but it traces Othello through the 18th century and into the 19th. And its sort of stage history and its repercussions in terms of the idea that Moors are made of ink or covered in it and can transfer it to their white lovers. So that's my story in a nutshell. Um, could I ask you another question? So I want to kind of go external to internal if we can. Um, I want to try to talk about the external threats to PCRS. Um, and then the internal challenges to the field, and its intellectual project. So, um, how do we deal? You know, Chris mentioned it when he introduced us. How do we deal with this moment in, you know, the kind of rightward push against critical race theory, which is sort of embedded in our name? The PCRS is Premodern Critical Race Studies, right? So it's embedded in our name. Um, and I feel like we haven't been attacked directly, you know, like it's not CRT, which, you know, which has been banned in law. Um, but, you know, we're a sister field to CRT, legal critical race theory, I mean. So, I mean, do you have any thoughts about how we deal with this moment?
Yeah. Heavy sigh first and foremost, and then and then we speak. Um, so yeah, the external threats, even just to higher education as a whole, is alarming. Um, and at the same time, I do think that the threats are promising. Hear me out.
Yes.
So, you know, when something is a threat, that means that it must matter, right? And if something is a threat, that means that there's a sense in which there is a truth that it embodies or that it carries that is now like a trigger point of some sort. So, in the one hand, to me, um, the threats are promising because it means that the work matters. It means that it's touching a critical point in our culture, a critical point in our literary critique, a point within our political realm and sphere that is necessary and has to be addressed. There's different approaches to how it's being addressed. We happen to choose to address these matters through our scholarship, through so many different lenses, right? So to me, it's encouraging. And then, um, secondly, sort of how I've approached these times is to think about my role primarily as a scholar and as an educator. And one of the things that sort of remains true to me is making sure that I am faithful to my work. So, regardless of external threats occurring, as an educator, for instance, like one of my goals is to provide my students with critical tools, methodologies, archives, texts, spaces in and outside of the classroom for them to sort of consider uh, this sort of toolbox, so to speak, that I'm providing them, and then to give them the opportunity to then go out into the world and assess and formulate intellectually sound opinions about what's going on in the world and how the work that we're engaging, whether in class, whether through scholarship, like how all of these things will help them to then operate as intellectually sound people engaging with this work. So those are the sort of two ways that I approach these threats.
Mhm. Intellectually sound and hopefully ethically sound. When I used to teach high school, I would say to students that the great challenge and pleasure of studying literature is learning to listen carefully to someone who is not you.
Mm. Hmm. Hmm.
And, you know, I think that the focus on skills and job preparedness and all of that, while I understand it because of the increasing cost of education, um, I think that that's priceless. And it's also a transferable skill. I mean, being able to, you know, to uh, I also used to say that it's about listening so well that you hear things in what someone else is saying that they may not have even noticed that they've said,
Mm.
which is another necessary skill, both, well, in every aspect of life, from the workplace to being a citizen and a consumer of media. So, um, I really take your point that that's part of why this is under attack. Um, because it's not just PCRS or critical race theory that's under attack, it's the entire humanities project,
Mm.
that's under attack. And we are in some ways, along with gender theory, we're like a scapegoat.
Mm.
But it's really so I really like what you said about the student thing because I think students can be our allies
Mm.
as we face this external threat. Um, they're not always, there are certainly students who are trying to report us to particular, um, I don't know what to call them, but particular organizations that surveil professors and get their celebrity, moment. Um, but I hope that the majority of students are still interested in that other project I described of learning how to listen to someone who is not you. The world is more interesting when there are voices that are not yours. That's the only way you can learn anything you don't already know is to hear something,
Mm.
from someone who is not you. Um, so yeah. Um, I would also emphasize, I'm thinking about the cultural capital that does accrue both to the period and to Shakespeare specifically, and that in some ways that is a shield, publicly. I mean, if I want to pass as not a dangerous scholar, I can just say I teach Shakespeare, and nobody questions that. Nobody thinks there's anything nefarious going on at all.
Mm.
And in some ways, there isn't, right? Like in some ways, there isn't. Um, but in addition to the cultural capital of Shakespeare, I want to talk a little bit later about. I do think that threatens the intellectual project a little bit, to be very Shakespeare focused. So I think it's an interesting dance, maybe, of, what we do publicly and what we do in our scholarship. There may have to be a little bit of a dance there. But I think the other thing in terms of cultural capital, is partnerships with institutions, like the Newberry, the Folger, the Huntington, you know, all these institutions that are also stakeholders uh, and sort of guardians of culture, um, and places for gathering.
Mm.
Places for gathering, places for education beyond the classroom, repositories of knowledge. Um, Knowledge is under attack. It's not just teaching, it's knowledge. And so I think that it's really great that uh, PCRS has reached out, to these kinds of institutions like the Newberry, and that they've been so responsive in providing safe harbor for us to
Mm.
continue to work. Um, so,
I was going to quickly mention too,
go
one
ahead.
of the points that you mentioned that was really imperative too was thinking about how like knowledge is under attack. And when you mentioned that, I was instantly thought about Michel Trouillot, where he's thinking about silencing the past, and like, history also seems to be under attack as well, and how we perfect.
I keep it nearby at all times.
Yes, yes. So it's interesting that, mentioning knowledge as being under attack, and then also historicity, right, is under attack too.
Yes. Well, because history um, is about both continuity and difference.
Mhm.
And so to me, that's one of the great partnerships between history and literature. You know, if I said that to me, literary study is learning to listen to someone who is not you, that's part of the historicity of literature, you know, is that shift in time or space. That's what creates the difference. That's what creates the not me, right?
Mm.
Which is not to say there's no continuity, I mean, that's part of the reason that I think critical race studies has been able to flourish is that people are interested in these long histories, of race. I'm not against continuity, far from it. But I guess that's another dance, between continuity and difference, in our work and in our teaching. Um, so I want to turn, I guess, to our intellectual project, our shared intellectual project in PCRS. Um, so, quick little anecdote. Um, I was a reviewer for a journal, a special issue of a journal, and I noticed that there was sort of a formula that you sort of cite things of darkness, something from like the first 3 pages, and then you cite um, something else from Margot Hendricks or Arthur Little, and then you cite one of the most recent collections on race.
Mm.
And once you do those 3 things, you just do your reading of whatever literary text, is in front of you. And that seemed to me to risk a kind of paint by numbers approach to the field. And it began to make me worry about um, the side effect of the popularity of the field is that um, it maybe loses some of its vigor and some of its drive to continue producing new knowledge and asking new questions, even self-critical questions, about the field and the project and its tendencies. So, what do you think are the most promising avenues that will allow us to continue developing and growing as a field?
Yeah. Um, First of all, great insight also on thinking about like the formulaic nature of how some of the work is approached. And I think it's also like a good self-reflection for me as well, just to keep that in mind as, sort of like a junior scholar and approaching sort of my research moving forward, like how to think about it. I think there may be a particular uh a desire to like sort of kind of give people their flowers and like making sure that you're showing that you're well read, that you're aware that what has happened before you, because sometimes there is also that insularity where like folks can just think that they're the ones inventing the wheel, and it's like, no, go way back. So maybe that's a part of the tendency as well, but as you mentioned, though, making sure that it's not a formula, because that like there's no fun in that. If we wanted formulas, we'd be in math. It's like, okay, and scene, we'll need. But yeah. So, but one of the most promising avenues I would say is, and it's actually challenging me as well. And I think we talked about this a while back, but when you asked me about like my research and things of that nature, but the move away from um, the English context, like going beyond England and thinking about like a global context in terms of like, so I'm thinking about Noemi Ndiaye, I'm thinking about Emily Wisbaum, and like all these other scholars who are thinking about Spain, France, like other contexts, even Kim Hall's most recent book that I'm currently reading right now, but Sweet Taste of Empire, like thinking about Caribbean literature, like so I think it's a two-pronged thing. First, going beyond England, expanding our vision of like sort of how race work is happening in a global context. And then also thinking about what other avenues could PCRS be in conversation with other methodologies or even just like, yeah, other approaches that we can place PCRS in conversation with. But I also want to say that um, I'm curious to know too if, just as much as we are trying to be in conversation with, different disciplines, et cetera, I do want to implore this need to also place PCRS in conversation with other methodology that folks working other periods or other disciplines engage with PCRS. So someone, for example, like Cord Whitaker, focusing on medieval studies, but is constantly, encouraging that bridge and not sort of making it uh, separating in that. And I think that is really helpful because it allows for a different audience or a different readership to be exposed to PCRS. And then, it gains more traction in that way. So if we could have more folks from different disciplines continuing that work, I think it would be really helpful.
You bring up one of my favorite things, which is work that's transtemporal.
Mm,
Uh, and but what I think is potentially fruitful and in a self-critical kind of way is we now have this umbrella term PCRS that includes people who study everything from antiquity up until the 18th century. Um, and as we're looking at the study of race in that, what I become interested in is is there a difference between how race functions, how it's structured and how it functions in the medieval period versus the early modern, right? Um, because like, oh, that's the thing I didn't mention. Like the citing of Geraldine Heng by early modernists concerns me, not because Heng's work isn't wonderful, but because she's a medievalist and and I'm not even saying that she's wrong or that her definition of race is wrong for early modernity, but the question should be asked, can I use this? Is it,
mm,
you know, does it apply? And so what I've, to go back quickly to the anecdote that I used at the beginning of this, uh, I as a reviewer, and that's also one of the things we can do is review things and review them with rigor and kindness. I said Bob Hornback has questioned Geraldine Heng's notion of race making as it applies to um, early modernity. And so, you should check him out. And he's not one of the three that are always cited, right? And thankfully, the folks read this and they produced a wonderful introduction that really is going to be furthering the conversation and not just coloring by numbers. Um,
mm,
so I think um, as we gather under this umbrella of PCRS, of course, we should be friendly to one another across periods. But I think if we're engaged in a shared project, you know, seeing both the continuity and the difference in this long story of race from antiquity through the 18th century, or even antiquity through the present, right? Where are the inflection points? Where does it change, both temporally and geographically? I think that that will really enrich and specify and particularize what we're doing, which will, of course, make it all the more politically dangerous because the more precise you are about, well, actually, you know, in Carriacou, of Granada in 1852, race was functioning this way, and that's quite different, from how it was functioning in metropolitan London in 1752, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that that's part of what's going to keep us vibrant is to actually be self-critical, um, which is not to say nasty,
mm,
but I'll just squeeze in one last thing because I know questions are coming. I think that's another way that other fields can be helpful. I'm thinking about race and ethnic studies the intersectionality wars have sort of happened in feminist studies, and it's not touched our field. And our field, because of Kim, because of Margot, because of Arthur, because of Ayanna, right, is very intersectional in its focus. But those intersectionality wars have sort of happened without us reconsidering our use of the term and our use of the phrase, right? And the same thing with race and ethnic studies. The wars over Afro-pessimism have sort of happened, and are ongoing in Black studies. But with the exception of Matthew Chapman, like we haven't really taken that up. And Noemi is going to in her forthcoming book, so that's great. But I think that continuing to seek uh, the new question, the surprising archival document, or whatever, I think that is going to keep us fresh. And I think it will also. I think it's a sign of maturity. I think we've reached that point. You talked about giving flowers. I think we've reached the point, where now um, we don't necessarily have to be in a bunker mentality where we're defending against a hostile early modern studies anymore. I think our legitimacy has been established. And so now I think it's time to tend to making sure this is an intellectually vibrant project for as long as we can make it one. And then passing it on like I to you. you know, I was in high school in the 90s. I was like, is Will Need gonna, punch her pearls on that or go the 90s? Good Lord.
Oh my goodness. Don't make me choke on my water.
So are we ready for questions?
I think we're ready if you're ready. We've got some questions in the chat, and we've got some others that are still coming in. So just a reminder, everyone, please feel free to go in and put your questions into the Q&A sort of box. We will get to as many as we can, but if we don't get to your questions, we will also keep a record of them, and we'll sort of see if it can be possible for Will Need and Miles to reach out to you later and follow up if that is necessary. But first, we'll start with our first question in the chat, I think, from Fernando. So Fernando has two questions, but we'll start with the first one of that two-part question, which is first of all, just to tell us more about the curriculum changes mentioned. So we're going all the way back to the beginning of the conversation. More about the curriculum changes mentioned into the one pilot program, which I believe is at your institution, right, Miles? So if you could say a little bit more about that. And then, so I guess we'll just start there because there is another question after that, but we'll just start with that one.
Well, I'll do that in a sentence, because it's not really about the study of race.
Mm.
Um, we went from a model of teaching English through surveys of
Mm-hmm.
British and then American literature to teaching courses based on methodology. So you wouldn't get the same coverage that you would get in a survey, but you would get training in historical methods in literary studies. So you might only read one, pre-modern British text, you know, one or two. I think two were required, but you wouldn't get that long sweep anymore. So that was the change. And yes, it is still in place.
Okay, cool. And the next part of that question, I think I'm gonna take my sort of moderator liberty and modify it just a bit, but sort of getting to a point that you were just talking about, Miles, and we'll need of thinking about things like periodization and chronology, and sort of thinking about these terms that we have in large part inherited from generations of scholars that were using before us. So early modern, for example, as Fernando points out, can sort of subordinate, as he says, the colonial aspect of it, even though practically speaking, it's impossible to think of the early modern period without colonization, and without everything that's been going on in that. And so, is there a way to sort of think about those terms that we use and sort of maybe help bring some of those connections that the terms themselves might cover up, if that makes any sense? Or is that something you find yourself doing with your students? Or maybe is it easier to just be like, you know what, let's just move past this because there's other things we want to focus on. So any thoughts you guys have on that would be very cool.
I have
Um,
one we'll need if you need time, but if you're
yeah,
ready,
yeah.
it's your turn.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So, there's a famous article by Anya Lumba where she presents the idea that the period should be called the early colonial period. And so I teach that sometimes. Um, but the fact is that we're structured around these terms. That's how they're listed in the course bulletins. That's how fellowships and jobs are awarded. So I think it's more important that colonialism be central in early modern studies than that we try to insist that the field be renamed early colonial. Because I don't know that we'll even win that, but we can win the other way, which Anya Lumba's article has. I mean, like so. I think that's how I deal with that.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, I think that's brilliantly thought of and certainly, yeah, expressed. I think when I think about the early modern period and just even just the sort of name that we provide, I think about it in juxtaposition to like the Renaissance and Scott Manning Stevens talks about how like even the Renaissance could be problematic as we're thinking about how like it is very much um not only like Anglo-centric, but very specific, and it's not thinking about a more global vision of like how other cultures, places are not are doing a work, are doing things, and it's not just sort of a European fixation. And so I think the early modern term kind of opens it up a bit more than thinking about the Renaissance and thinking about like, Italy and, England, etc. So when I think about discussing that with students, that tends to be like how I go about approaching them.
Wonderful. Thank you guys for sharing that so much. This next question comes from Megan Heffernan. Megan says, thanks so much to both of you for sharing your wisdom in this forum. We agree. The labor you are investing in your classrooms and in the field is admirable. And I love the bid to develop and enrich the historicity of PCRS. So her question is, would you like to share any new texts or questions or theorists you're thinking about now? And how you think about the question of temporal models either in your classroom or in your research. So, kind of building off the last one. So, any thoughts you guys have of useful texts, useful theorists, useful ways of tackling these sort of thorny issues going forward?
Well, um, first of all, thanks, Megan. Hi. Um, I I'll say that, for me, the the place where early modern and 18th century studies cross is becoming increasingly interesting. Um, for historians, the early modern, for some historians, or the early modern goes all the way up to Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, you know. So the fact that literary scholars ended at the Restoration, and that's of course only English literary scholars ended at the Restoration, you know, is creating a kind of interesting tension. So that's of interest to me. Um, why we select that moment in English literary history, and whether that stands and will hold in a more transatlantic conversation. So I'm looking at Aphra Behn's The Widow Ranter now. It's certainly not a new text, It's not one that's studied much, but Aphra Behn is certainly canonical now. Uh, But I feel like what I'm finding in the scholarship is that most of it is attempting to locate her in British politics. It's understanding her as an English writer, so all the references are understood, to be to internal politics in England, the Glorious Revolution, the the Tories, all that kind of thing. But of course, it's set during Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, which is the key moment for early Americanists about the creation of race as the consequence of the failure of Bacon's Rebellion, right? So, I think that that's, a fruitful place to go, and I've got forthcoming work, on that.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you, Megan, for your question as well. So I'll take these question in terms of thinking about like texts that I incorporate or am working on incorporating as well as I think about next semester and some texts that have worked. So in terms of like one of the things that I think about often is sort of we know at least when it pertains to like Shakespeare, for example, like students tend to, come into the classroom and assume, oh, I've read Othello. I know everything to be said about it. Or I don't really like what's the point or whatever the case may be. But and so I'm always thinking about what text to introduce them to relating to that can then open up the door to converse about PCRS without it necessarily being Shakespeare centric. And so uh, I might like in one course I had students, read The Duchess of Malfi, but we're also thinking about sort of the ways in which David Sterling Brown's like White Others or Shakespeare's White Others, but still thinking about the ways in which some of the concepts, theories like can be imported in other texts outside of Shakespeare in that way. And then also white people in Shakespeare, right, with Arthur Little and that collection. So I'm thinking about ways to reintroduce the early modern racial matrix as the way Ninja likes to explain it. I love that idea of like race as a matrix, but decentering Shakespeare, but at the same time to still using Shakespeare as an interlocutor to open up the text, but wanting students to see beyond that at the same time.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. This next question, I don't know who it's from. It's from an anonymous attendee, but it is a good question. And it's asking you to explain further what you meant by the intersectionality wars in our fields and sort of what that means and what the role of that might be as we look into the immediate future of this field.
Well, there is no intersectionality war in PCRS, right? We use the method of thinking of multiple types of oppression simultaneously, race, religion, gender, class, um, empire. There's that famous essay by Margaret Ferguson, Juggling the Categories. So since the 90s, because of feminist scholars, uh, intersectional methods have been central to the study of race. Race is seen as operating alongside these other modes of oppression and in interesting, chemical reactions with them as well. Um, but in feminist studies outside of the early modern, um, um, oh, her name is suddenly escaping me. Oh my goodness. Um, Maybe I can look it up in my Zotero very quickly. There is a feminist scholar whose name is escaping me, who's been talking about the uh, kind of proprietary relationship uh, that uh, Black women scholars have had to intersectionality, and whether or not um, that can hold. And so different scholars who've been trying to um, question, I'm trying to look it up. That this is driving me insane that I can't think of her name, but it's just not coming up. Okay. I'll get back to you. Um, but there have been critiques about intersectionality being co-opted by the university. That's Jasbir Puar in terrorist assemblages. There have been um, critiques about whether or not intersectionality is a universal or whether it's specifically supposed to be applied to Black women's social predicaments, which is sort of how Kimberly Crenshaw initially formulated it, you know. So those are interesting questions, and they've been very productive in feminist studies and American studies. But we've sort of continued applying intersectionality as we were doing in the 90s, which was brilliant and which was a great step forward. But I'd be curious to know what would happen if we took on board and if we got interested in some of these other debates about whether and how to use intersectionality.
I agree.
All right. Thank you. A couple more questions. This next one comes from Chloe Glass. She says, thank you for sharing your experience in research in PCRS. As a PCRS art historian, I'm particularly encouraged by your support of interdisciplinary studies. You discussed the need to be discerning about applying theory with attention to context, but I'm curious about your approach with primary sources that themselves are transnational or transtemporal. And Chloe says her research focuses on prints that travel between countries and thus different audiences. So, any thoughts you guys have on that would be great.
I'm going to let you take that when you're ready, Whitney.
Yeah. Um, Christopher, would you mind just repeating the second half of the question just to make sure that I understood correctly?
Yes. The half after how you think about the question of temporal models. Oh, no, sorry. That's a different one. Sorry. Wrong question. I was looking at the wrong thing. Curious about your approach with primary sources that themselves are transnational or transtemporal. And Chloe gave the example of her own research, which focuses on prints that travel between countries and thus are engaged with by different audiences. Is that
Hmm.
what you were looking for, Wilney?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for that question. And it's great to have an art historian who's also working on PCRS, in the crowds. So thank you so much, and thank you for attending and for your question. Um, I think this is a brilliant question to sort of think about, like how we're approaching like primary sources in and their transnational nature. I think about, for example, uh, the work of like travel literature within like race making and race building um, projects, and how when you're thinking about these Englishmen or, European men traveling to other parts of the world and sort of providing their insights of what they think about these people or that person, whatever case may be, and how, to me, like those sources are really important as I think about the work that I'm doing, because we know that, for example, travel literature uh, was really important, especially for folks, let's say, who maybe never traveled, outside of where their particular realm or sphere is. And so these travel narratives bring forth or travel themselves in a way to new contexts and sort of provide people with what they assume to be real vocabulary as to how to think about or imagine people in different national spaces and things of that nature. Um, and so to me, it is imperative to sort of approach these texts as thinking about how they are constantly providing people in their context as insight as to sort of how to read different bodies and how to approach them. So, for example, I think about Ben Jonson, right? In his Mask of Blackness, he sort of briefly discusses, like, oh, I read all of these travel narratives and they helped me to figure out sort of how to think about Blackness. And it's like, okay, that's interesting. So, someone else's travels gives you insight on how to then think about this mask of Blackness in relation to Queen Anna. So it's quite interesting, like how those connections are being made. So when I think about primary sources, that's how I sort of think about it and approach them.
If I can interject one sentence here, I think the exciting thing about transnational work is that race, at least one definition of race, is that it's these sort of pan-ethnic groupings. You know,
Mm,
it's people who formerly understood themselves to be of different ethnicities deciding that they have something shared in common. For political reasons, right? Um, and so I think we focus a lot on the dominating side of race and race as difference, but race as a process of making alike is something that we have not looked at as a process. Like we assume it. It's like, oh yes, we're alike. But to actually detail the process. So if we're following an archival, um, if we're following something from the archive as it travels, we're sort of following a community that's being connected by these dots. Or that's not what I meant, but we're as we each dot in the travel, of the source is a point of potential connection. It could also be a point of disconnection, but it's a potential point of connection, and we can actually track how something like whiteness is being formed, and not only the way we've done it previously, which is like, well, yes, it's whiteness was invented for the purposes of domination, so we have to wait until there's colonization in order to see it. And it's like, no, you can see it, as people consume something and consider that they're alike. And that was more than one sentence. My apologies.
The more sentences, the better.
Okay.
Um, also, maybe just a quick jump in there too is that she's not here, but this is, I think, a place where book history as a field and bibliography is also really important about thinking about. So the she I mentioned is Brandy Adams, though she's far from the only one who's been doing this work, but that's been something we at the center have also really enjoyed thinking through as well, is taking these objects in themselves and the different audiences that engage with them and how they were designed to do that and how different people responded. I think it's a really sort of wonderful way to bring in some of these questions. Like you can just start with the object itself and kind of go from there and think about these different audiences. So wherever you are, Brandy, thank you. And everyone should read her and know how to handle that. Okay, well, we are at time. So to everyone out there, apologies if we were unable to get to all of your questions. Again, feel free to reach out to us. I do have a couple of housekeeping things to say right here at the end, though. First of all, most importantly, we want to thank Miles and Will Need for this wonderful conversation. This is such a very difficult situation that we're living in, but something I particularly appreciated is how hopeful this is. I kind of want to have the threat is promising put on a T-shirt and just wear it all the time because I think this is such an important sort of thing to keep in mind. So thank you all very much for that. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Please note that this program will be posted online along with our other conversations on our CRS YouTube page. You can see a link to it there. And we will be announcing our next conversation that it comes up. We'll be focusing on Asia this time. So trying to expand the different types of conversations. But for now, we wish you all a wonderful Friday, a good weekend, wherever you are. We hope that you're staying warm wherever you are, and we look forward to more conversations about PCRS here and other places at the Newberry. So take care, everyone. Have a wonderful day, and we'll all see you for our next Race and Dialogue conversation.